Okay, so they were just waiting on me. Good evening, everybody. Good evening. Man, thank you so much for coming out here to another Church of the Cross equipping event. If you are here tonight and if you're new here, so my name is Joseph Tenney and I'm one of the pastors here and just want to say welcome. Hey, I want to encourage you, so after Dr. Yancey's talk, tonight we're going to have a bit of Q&A, and so want to encourage you to get out your phones if you haven't already, and you can snap or get the camera app out and hit that QR code there, and that is how we are going to be engaging with tonight's material, with the talk tonight through Slido. So you can log on here to ask your questions. You can ask as many questions as you would, as you prefer. We will try to get to as many as possible. So I want to encourage you to do that, all right? And y'all can start asking your questions whenever you would like throughout the evening, and then we will get to that toward the end. And then after our time of Q&A, we're actually going to spend some time just kind of closing out our time together in prayer. So, well, friends, we believe that that the first task of the church is to not make the church the world or the world the church, but to really make the world, make the church, and to think about questions and issues Christianly, theologically. So how do we think about questions of life, or how do we think about this racial conversation Christianly, on Christian terms? And so that's one of the things that we are doing tonight, and we are so excited to have Dr. George Yancey with us. He has a degree in economics from West Texas State. He has a doctorate in sociology from A&M. Yep, he's a former professor at the University of North Texas and currently holds a position at Baylor University with a joint appointment in sociology and the Institute of Religious Studies. There you go. He is the author of numerous books, So Many Christians, So Few Lions, Beyond Racial Gridlock, of course, and Beyond Racial Division, a unifying alternative to colorblindness and anti-racism. So we are so excited to have you here, Dr. Yancey. Thank you so much for being here. How about we give a warm Church of the Cross welcome to Dr. Yancey.
I do have to correct one thing. My doctorate is not from A&M. It is from UT Austin. So, I could not let that stand. In a post-Christian world, why should anyone want to become a Christian if we sound like everyone else on moral issues? Why? Now, I know that being a Christian doesn't matter like on math, 3 + 3 = 6, no matter what. But on moral issues, if we sound like everyone else, what difference does it make? Does our Christian faith offer us insight into the great moral issues of the day? And who could not agree that in the United States today, one of the great moral issues of the day is racism and how we deal with centuries of racial abuse? Given that, what are we saying as Christians? Do we sound like everyone else? Or are we offering something different? I would contend that generally we sound like everyone else, and yet we could offer something different. The question I'm posing today: can Christianity teach us anything unique about racism? Something we're not hearing from others? Can we offer something that others are not seeing because of our faith? I say we can, and I say we should be doing that. What I'm going to do first part is talk about what others are offering and why I think what others are offering fails. And then I will build a case for what we should be offering, what we should be doing, what we should be saying. And I will base it on my Christian faith, on a Christian understanding of reality, of the nature of humans. And then we will go from there. This is, of course, a target. It's the hot issue, one of the hot issues of the day. I would say that other than COVID, this has been the hottest issue this past year. All right, let's do a little background. A racialized society. That's a society where race matters profoundly for differences in life experiences, life opportunities, and social relationships. We have a racialized society. Me being an African American matters in my life experiences. I experience things differently because I'm Black than I would otherwise. My opportunities. I know in my background, there have been opportunities given sometimes. Sometimes when I walk on a basketball court, people say, hey, he can play, he's black. There are also opportunities that have been taken away in my life personally, and I know this for a fact. Social relationships. Social relationships matter, right? If it didn't matter, how come our social networks tend to be people of our own race? We live in a racialized society. Race matters. And it has mattered since the beginning of the United States. And part of the racialized society is racism and the effects of racism. So how do we deal with that? How do we deal with racism? There's two major contrasting views of racism in our society today. The first is that racism is something that is overt and only done from one individual to another individual. In other words, if I look at my students at Baylor and say, I don't like these white students, I'm gonna take 5 points off their test, people say that's racism because you yourself are punishing people based on their race. Individuals with this perspective tend to latch on to what's called a colorblindness answer to racism, which means that the way to get rid of racism is not to ignore race. If somehow we woke up tomorrow and we're all light green and we thought, hey, we're all the Hulks, we can't see race. That would be paradise in this perspective because then no race, no racism. Another approach towards racism is that racism is structural as well as individualistic. Our social structures matter. And social institutions can perpetuate racism even when individuals do not intend to be racist. So let me just give you an example. Back in Jim Crow, the system that mandated that blacks could not use the same facilities as whites, it did not matter if you as an individual was not racist. You living in that society and reinforcing the rules of that society perpetuated racism, according to this perspective. Those who have this perspective tend to latch onto some form of what's been known as anti-racism. I know that's a term that before CRT became popular 15 minutes ago, everyone was talking about. So, colorblindness and anti-racism are the two solutions given to us. Let's ask whether they're good solutions. Now, for colorblindness to be viable, what has to happen is that we have to have a fair society. You don't ignore problems and they go away, right? If they're playing a football game and the refs allow one team to hold the defensive lineman and they build up a 28-point lead, and then you say, hey, all right, we'll be blind to the rules now, we'll be fair. That doesn't solve the problem because the problem is this team has an unfair advantage. And even if we look at the historical aspect and say, well, we'll be fair from now on, if the refs continue to cheat, then saying we're blind to this is not a way that makes it viable. For colorblindness to be viable, at the very least, the races today have to be treated equally. Research shows that it is not. For example, this study that in 2017 shows that there was no real decrease in racial discrimination in hiring over the past 25 years. Now, the reason why they know this is they do what's called audit studies, which means they take an applicant and they usually use the names to indicate race because, Leroy is black, Jose is Hispanic, and Joe is white. So they'll do that. And then they'll see whether or not the person will be called back for a job interview. And they do what they can. There's techniques to make sure that basically the same resume is getting sent out. And I won't go all into that. That's a methodological thing. It'll bore you to tears. What they found is that over the past 25 years, white applicants are called back. Now, it's not that white applicants are called back more, black and Hispanic called back more 25 years ago, and slowly we've been increasing. What they show, because there's been a lot of these studies, it's not just one or two, okay? What they show is that it's been the same. We've had no decrease in discrimination as far as occupational hiring for the past 25 years. There's a phenomenon known as driving while black. African Americans are pulled over more than European Americans. Now, is it because we speed more? Well, what this researcher did, looking at the state of Ohio, was measure how fast people are driving. And basically, blacks drive as badly as whites. Nothing to be proud of. But despite the fact that the driving speeds of blacks are the same as whites, blacks are pulled over more often. Other researchers looked at other states, and they find the same thing. Blacks are pulled over more often. Now, is this just a little bit inconvenient? You know, you're stopped for 10 minutes and you're sitting on your way. Maybe you have to pay a little ticket. You know, I'm showing only a few studies. There's a lot of studies in criminology that shows that African Americans and Hispanic Americans, all things being equal, are more likely to be arrested, more likely to be charged, more likely to be convicted, and if convicted, more likely to serve a heavier sentence. So this is really connected to a big body of research in criminology and the way race matters. We live in a racialized society. Residential segregation still impacts the educational outcomes for people of color. You know, we know, here in the DFW, we know certain cities are more white, right? And others are more black, and others are more Hispanic. We know that there's segregation. And actually, Dallas is not as bad as, say, Chicago or Buffalo. And what this research found is that segregation means you have black schools and Hispanic schools and white schools. And when the black and Hispanic schools are of lower quality, then this impacts the educational outcomes for people of color. I actually did not go to a black school in high school. I went to a Hispanic school. It was mostly Hispanics. I won't go all into it, but I just did. And our school sucked at everything but one thing. I mean, we sucked at football. We cheered when we finally beat this other team that we hadn't beaten in like 25 years. But the one thing we did really, really well was industrial arts. And so it wasn't surprising, since we did so well in industrial arts, that it did not prepare us for college. When I went off to college, I met a lot of people from the other high schools and very few from my own high school. Because that was a Hispanic school, and we were teaching Hispanic workers to build homes. There's evidence of racism in the beliefs and practices of medical health care providers. They looked at 39 studies. They found evidence of racism in 26 of them. Things such as what doctors prescribe differed by race, how doctors thought about patients differed by race. If you want to understand why there's a vaccine hesitancy among African Americans and Hispanic Americans, part of it is that they have experienced this racism in the healthcare system. Colorblindness is viable only if we can actually say they were treating everyone the same. I have 4 studies up here. I could put 40 up here. If I spent some time, I could put 400 up here. It's not the same in our society. Colorblindness is not viable as a long-term solution. Well, what about the other one, anti-racism? You know, I laid out 2 solutions, colorblindness, anti-racism. Colorblindness not viable, anti-racism must be. Well, what is anti-racism? Very proactive in an approach. So it doesn't assume that there's no racism. In fact, it looks to make sure that we're dealing with racism, because racism is not just an individual, it's also in our social structures. Focuses on unfair advantages or privileges of being white. White privilege, the advantages of whiteness. There's a lot of talk about that. And by the way, the reason why I know this is I've read the literature, the major literatures on anti-racism in the popular press. So a lot of these things I find in multiple books. Some talk about implicit bias, indicates a hidden racism, that people think they're not racist, but really there's this sort of implicit bias that they have. The focus on taking action to dismantle all aspects of racism. So it's not just individual racism, but also structural racism. Things that we may not think about that are racist, but have a disproportionate impact on people of color. Some talk about ending whiteness. Now, to be sure, this is not some sort of genocidal notion. When they talk about ending whiteness, we're talking about ending elements in white culture, in our society, that gives whites an unfair advantage. And listening to people of color, for whites to listen to people of color rather than taking over. There's a big emphasis on whites not taking over and letting people of color talk instead. In fact, if you look at things such as white fragility, one can fairly argue whether whites are allowed to speak at all. Okay. Has this approach been successful? Well, first, the whole thing on implicit bias. One thing, when those tests came out, people were excited. Hey, we can discover hidden racism. More and more are finding that those tests are flawed. We're not sure what they measure. They measure something. We've been unable, I say we, I've not done these tests, but as academics, been unable to connect implicit bias to actual discrimination. So they'll do these implicit bias tests, then they'll say the person discriminates, and there's no correlation. So the notion of implicit bias as a source of discrimination, it's hard to buy it at this point in time. Now, one of the mechanisms people who do anti-racism talk about is doing training, teaching people about these concepts, teaching people to be more proactive. And so we've done diversity training. I imagine many, if not most of you all, have had diversity training at some point in your life. Well, here's what we know. Diversity training has little long-term effect on prejudice. I liken it to going off to youth camp, all right? So you go off to youth camp, you hear great words to the Lord, yeah, I'm on fire for Jesus. And you come back from youth camp, you're on fire for Jesus for about a week. And then, things just sort of drift back down. Now, I'm sure there's some that it is a life-changing experience, but that's something that's a fairly common thing. Well, same thing with diversity training. Short-term effects are very powerful. Long-term, about 6 months later, your level of prejudice is the same as it was before the training. So we have to ask the question, is this really a way we're going to make any sort of change? Is it worth putting people under diversity training just when there's no long-term effect? By the way, you may or may not know this, but when you look at the amount of money U.S. corporations spend every year on diversity training, we're talking $8 billion, and that's billion with a B. That's a lot of money to get no long-term effects. This is an interesting study. Talking about privilege creates less sympathy for whites, but does not increase the sympathy for blacks. The idea is we talk about white privilege, and people become sympathetic to people of color because they don't have the privilege whites do. But what this researcher found is that what actually happens is that people become less sympathetic to marginalized whites. Whites who are homeless, who are on drugs, who are poorly educated, but their sympathy for African Americans in this case does not increase at all. So the sum total of teaching about privilege actually seems to be to decrease sympathy for marginalized people. Not to decrease it for one group and increase for another, decrease it for one group and keep the same for another. So it's an overall decrease. This is, I think, the most interesting study because it kind of contrasts from the ideas I'm going to present later on with an anti-racist approach, which is very proactive, step in, let's do something about it. So what they did was they looked at all these corporations, mid to large corporations. And I forget the number, I want to say about 500 or 600 corporations. They assess what are you doing to increase the number of managers of color, not workers, people who make decisions, managers of color. What sort of techniques are you using? They came back 5 years later and they said, do you have more managers of color here or not? When corporations use things such as mandatory diversity training or grievance systems so people of color can file a complaint if they feel they're wrong, or altering job tests to make it better for people of color, those corporations 5 years later actually had fewer managers of color. So being proactive, saying you're going to do this, we're going to do this to make sure you hire more managers of color. 5 years later, you have fewer managers of color. Anti-racism does not seem to be working. It may sound good for some individuals, but ultimately, you're not getting the results. Now, why is it that colorblindness and anti-racism, which is what people are talking about, when you see the argument on race, it's usually around these lines to some degree or another. Why is it that it doesn't work? Let me make a suggestion. This is the truth that both approaches lack, and that's the notion of human depravity. And this is the notion that we can bring in as Christians that right now is not being brought into our discussion on race. Yes, they talk about depravity, but they're usually talking about depravity as someone else, not human depravity, as in all of us have this problem. Okay, I'm in a church, so I have to throw some scripture at you, okay? All right, what do I mean by human depravity? These are just 3 scriptures. You can find more. The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of his thoughts of his heart was only evil continuously. Genesis 6:5. None is right. No, not one. No one understands. No one seeks for God. Romans 3:10 and 11. The natural person does not accept the things of the Spirit of God, for they are folly to him. And he is not able to understand because they are spiritually discerned. 1 Corinthians 2:14. And we go on. The Bible clearly teaches that we are fallen, that on our own, we tend to do evil. It's not that every single thing we do is evil, but that's where our tendency lies. So what does this mean? Well, to understand this, I was very fortunate to be in grad school and to learn about the Enlightenment movement and to learn about the goals of the Enlightenment movement, because this creates a contrast when you're not thinking about human depravity. And that's the notion of human perfectibility. And so to understand this, and we're talking about race today, but I think that this is an incredibly important dividing line between a Christian worldview point and a humanist worldview point, or atheist worldview point. Maybe the dividing line is not as strong when you're looking at other religions, but definitely between Christianity and a humanist viewpoint, this is incredibly important, in some ways more important than even whether there's a God or not, as far as philosophically. Human perfectibility versus human depravity. Human perfectibility, let's understand this for a second. Human perfectibility is a notion that humans become better with education. That the problem is humans are inherently good, but their upbringing, they're taught wrong. If we can educate them in the right way, then people will become better. Societies will become better. It's their lack of education, their lack of socialization that's holding people back. It's not necessarily an internal depravity. You haven't been taught right, and that's the problem. Humans are rational creatures who can become convinced to become better. Now, I must admit, when I heard this argument, at the time I didn't have kids. Now I've had kids, and I've got to think that the people who made this argument also did not have kids at that time. But the idea is that, ultimately, we are the pinnacle of evolution. We are rational, and thus, with our rationality, we can create better. It's in our hands to create utopia. And we can do it, we're properly educated, and we can become better through our rationality, as opposed to superstition and religion, which is what the Enlightenment thinkers were arguing against. Thus, and now to apply this, now you can apply this in a lot of ways, obviously, but to apply this in our racial situation, if our insight, be it anti-racism or colorblindness, is adopted, then we can move towards the end of racial alienation. See, the problem with both systems, even though they are diametrically opposed when it comes to solutions, both systems ultimately say, look, here's what we got to do. We get people to buy into what we got to do, and then that solves it. Both systems do this. Anti-racism, this is why we have all these anti-racism programs you're seeing. Those who've undergone diversity training, intention is to change your mind, to think a certain way, to approach, to be willing to end whiteness. You cannot read the anti-racism books I've read and not come away thinking, okay, the purpose of this is to convince, usually mostly white people, here's what you all have to do in order to solve racism. So if white people do this, then we have utopia. But the same thing is true with colorblindness. About a year ago, my oldest right now is 6, and a year ago he was about 5. And questions of birds and bees were coming up, and I was like, oh, I gotta talk to him about this. But I also was realizing, I can't just stop there. Even I'm biracially married, and he doesn't look super dark, but he is a biracial kid. And even if he wasn't, I gotta talk about issues of race with him as well. And so I wanna, I know that I'm an expert on race, but as a father, that was the first time I ever had a 5-year-old. So I asked on Facebook some of my friends who had kids of color, how do you approach talking to your kids about race? I just wanted to get some clues, some insights. And so I posted that on my Facebook page, and I got some. I also got quite a few people who posted back, even after I asked them, look, if you don't have a kid of color, please, I want someone with experience right now. But I had a lot of people who do not have kids of color who are posting things such as, why are you bringing up the topic of race at all? Just raise them to be good men. Don't worry about them being good black men. Just raise them to be good men. And that's all you really have to be concerned about. So what's happening here is advocates of colorblindness say it's not just enough for them to be colorblind. I have to be colorblind. We all have to be colorblind. Then we solve the problem. Whether they recognize it or not, they're taking a humanistic, rational perspective to solving the problem of racism. Because they're saying, you have to think like me, and then we solve the problem. That's human perfectibility. Human perfectibility, it's one of the reasons why we don't forgive in our society today. Because if you can't be perfect, then why aren't you perfect? And so if you do something wrong, why can't we cancel you? Because you are wrong, and you can be perfect instead. Follow the right education. This is within the realm of a humanist framework for solving social problems, including racism. We as Christians need to offer something other than this. And we need to base it on our understanding of human depravity. Human depravity, humans are inherently selfish, and that cannot be taken away with by education. When you've been in academia, you realize that for a lot of academics, education is a solution to almost everything. To prejudice, to poverty, to environmental issues. We just educate people, it'll solve itself. Well, there's a problem with that. It doesn't always solve itself because education doesn't deal with the moral issues. There's research out there by a couple of colleagues of mine that looked at whites and looked at education. And survey after survey after survey shows the more educated whites are, the less racist they are. So if you ask them, would you live in a community with people of other races? The more educated whites are, the more likely they are to say yes. Would you send your kids to a school that's racially mixed? More higher education, more likely to say yes. Then my friends went and actually looked at where whites lived and where they sent their kids to school. There's data out there on that. And what they found out after you do the proper social controls is the more education a white person has, the less likely they are to send their kids to integrated school, to actually do that, and the less likely they are to actually live in an integrated neighborhood. And the difference is not income, because I know some of you might be thinking that, because they controlled for income. In fact, when they did the controls, the income went away. Education was left. Education doesn't make us a better moral person. It may help us be able to hide our immoralities more easily. Only by accounting for our desire to protect our self-interests can we deal with group conflict. Let's get to the nitty-gritty of this. We tend to find solutions that meet our interests or the interests of people that we care about. And we tend to be blind to the weaknesses of our solutions, and we tend to exaggerate the weaknesses of alternate solutions. Even though we struggle against it, and as well we should, there is a certain amount of selfishness that comes into our thinking when we're trying to solve these sort of problems, if we're very honest. Somehow we have to account for that, for our own protecting of our own self-interests, if we're going to deal with this sort of group conflict. Only by holding each other accountable can we find solutions for racial alienation. So I stand up here, an African-American man, a man who studied race and racial issues for decades. And I know that I could offer solutions, and I will try to offer the best solutions, but I also know that ultimately I suffer from confirmation bias. I suffer from human depravity. As hard as I work at it, it is impossible for me to get away from that completely. So how can I get away from that? Best way I can is to listen to other people. And not that I have to agree with everything that everyone says, because some people say some crazy stuff, people. But I have to try to listen to others, and they have to try to listen to me if we're going to find solutions. If we're going to deal with the depravity in me, I have to be around others. Now, as a Christian, we can say, well, couldn't God just give us a solution? The problem with that is that we tend to interpret God's answers through our own cultural lenses. And, you know, one of the things that sometimes we Christians do is we don't assume just how powerful culture has on us. There are some things that are really clear in the Bible and it's hard to get away from. There's a lot of things that our cultural lens really does impact us. And I think on the issues of race, it really does. So we hold each other accountable, we can find solutions. This leads then to what I've called the mutual accountability approach. And I argue it's a Christian-based approach whereby we recognize that people of all races have a sin nature that has to be accounted for. Thus, everyone has to work towards healthy interracial communications to solve racial problems. This approach says everybody has this responsibility. Everybody. Now, the solution may not be that everyone has the exact same responsibility, okay? Some people will think, oh, you're actually kind of doing colorblindness because you're saying everyone's going to have the same responsibility in the solution. No, not necessarily. In fact, probably unlikely given our centuries of racial abuse. But everybody, I don't care what race you are, I don't care what you've suffered from in the past, you must come and enter into this conversation with all of us. And we must work to make it a healthy conversation. Now, tonight I don't have time to really go into the dynamics of that. But we have to have a healthy interracial conversation, which we're not having today. I asked you, what can we offer as Christians that's not being done today? Let me tell you, very little has been done today on having healthy interracial conversations. And they're going to be hard. Just pre-warning you. Is there empirical work to support my notion? Yes, there is. We know that under the right conditions, interracial contact can help to alleviate bias. Now, it doesn't always alleviate bias. Under the wrong conditions, it can make bias worse. But under the right conditions, and we kind of know what those conditions are, interracial contact alleviates our bias, helps us to not be as hostile towards people in other groups. We also know that having a common group identity increases positive feelings. When I was an undergrad, I went to West Texas State University. And I think this is where you got the A&M. It's now called West Texas A&M, but I don't call it West Texas State A&M. I was in a dorm, and the guys in our dorm, we were united. So when we played the other dorms, they're trash. We didn't like them because our group identity increased our positive feelings towards each other. Now, when we went to the football game, all the dorms going to the football game, then we were united because now we were the West Texas State Buffalo Thunders. And playing, say, Tulsa or someone like that. And now we're united and they're trash. Having a group identity increases positive feelings. The more we can feel that we're in the same group together, the more we let barriers down. And this is what healthy relations can do. Families with a collaborative orientation means they work together, they have purpose-driven conversations, have more positive interactions and relations with each other. So families that collaborate together, work together, that ends up having these positive relationships together. The more we actually collaborate with each other rather than work against each other, the more positive relationships we're going to have. Collaborative communication and an atmosphere of mutual support can create relational compliance. Think about it this way. No matter which side you may be on, you could win temporarily politically. You get, you're president, you're Congress, you sweep out a law of the school board, whatever. And you can win. And what you will have is a strong minority of people who will do everything they can to sabotage your victory. And they will stay there. They're not going away. They're not going away. They're going to keep sabotaging until they can ruin your victory or they can get power themselves. And you can go back and forth, back and forth. Or we can have a collaborative communication where we get together, we figure out what you need, what I need, and what's the best system to meet all of our needs, and we move together. And that creates volitional compliance. Now, we work together. Instead of having 40% of the society trying to sabotage us, we get 89% of the society is saying, let's work together and try to make this work. Huge difference. What's the implication of this approach? No one has all the right answers. We will get better answers listening to each other, okay? Now, at some point you say, well, is all we do is talk and listen? No, sometimes you have to do something. But you have to at least start by listening to each other. The solution cannot be, I have the answer, I'm a force on everyone else. Because even if my answer was right, the force on everyone else is going to create more strife. We got to listen to each other and get even better answers, get more insight. We need intentional effort to collaborative conversation. This is not going to happen on its own. Think, hey, let's just have these conversations and sing Kumbaya and walk to the sunset together. It's not going to happen on its own. We have to intentionally decide we're going to have collaborative conversations. The needs of everyone must be respected. This does not mean that you're going to get everything. In fact, part of what this is going to do is going to help you prioritize what's really important. Because, and those of you who are married know this, you're not going to get everything, all right? And so you decide what's really important because you really don't want a spouse who has to seem to give in to you all the time because that is going to blow up for you eventually. You have to have a give and take. But everyone's needs have to be respected. We have to respect everyone's needs and listen and hear them out. Skills of active listening and productive communication is valued in this sort of approach. And, this, I would love to talk more about what active listening and communication is. Don't have the time for it in this short presentation. But we've got to think more about developing these skills for ourselves rather than skills on how to win the debates. Work is towards solutions that are win-win instead of win-lose. Now, obviously, clearly, not everyone is going to, there's no solution where 100% of the people are going to go, okay, I'm on the board. So we can't be unrealistic and think, I have to have everyone on board, we can't move forward. But we can find solutions where most people in most groups feel comfortable with it. I believe that we can. I believe if we try, it'll be hard, but I think we can do that. And those are the ones we can move forward on because they're win-win. No one gets everything, but everyone gets something. It's not that I have 50 plus 1% of the vote, therefore, the rest of y'all, I don't care what you have to say. That is not allowable under this sort of system. Under this sort of system, everyone has their voice. We try to find solutions to benefit the most people. We'll probably fail sometimes, but we keep working at it until we can move forward together, most people. And, some people will ask, aren't there people we can't have conversations with? Yes, there are. And looking at some studies, my estimate, because I don't have precise questioning, my estimate is probably about 15, maybe 20% of the country are so wedded to colorblindness that they don't engage in the conversation. About 15, maybe 20% are so wedded to anti-racism, they won't either. So I think there's like 60 to 70% who, they may lean one way or the other, but they want something better. Because of what I've taught, I often have whites who come to me and say, you know what? After George Floyd or after Arbery or after, Trayvon Martin or, I knew racism was a big problem. I knew that I couldn't ignore it any longer. I knew it was more than just my individuals. I knew there was something out there, and I wanted to do something about it. And so I joined this group or that group or this group. But then when I joined that group, I heard stuff such as ending whiteness, and I knew I was not allowed to speak, and I knew that my contribution was not welcome. I knew this couldn't be the solution either. So what am I gonna do? There's a lot of people like that out there. There's people of color who are frustrated too, because they sense that anti-racism is not the problem, but you can't ignore the race that they've experienced, racism they experience. I think there's a lot of people who are ready to do this. And if we as Christians can move in this direction, in a post-Christian society, we can have a huge impact in society. And people will go, maybe I want to go to church to learn about this. What if our churches were known as the places where people had good, healthy, interracial conversations? What if they became known for that? What would that mean in a post-Christian society? Thank you for your time, and I look forward to taking your questions.
All right, we're going to continue to take some questions. You can type those questions in there. You can scan that QR code, and if you have any questions you'd like to ask, maybe there's some things that Dr. Yancey didn't have time to cover that were questions you had coming into tonight that you would like to type in. Feel free to do that. Questions that not necessarily touched on what he spoke on tonight, but questions that you're curious about. So we did have a few, so thank you, Dr. Yancey, for your time tonight. And I'll pose these questions to you, and you can give us your thoughts on them. So first, what do you say to someone who genuinely believes that racism no longer exists? And I know you shared some of the studies and some examples, but could you elaborate more on that? What you say to someone who genuinely believes that racism no longer exists?
Yeah, what those people usually say is, yeah, there's individual races, okay? So there's individual races, but generally speaking, there's not systematic racism. And so, for me, I would share some of the studies that shows, look, if as an African American, if people didn't, it wouldn't affect me because my name is George, so that kind of sounds a little whitish, I guess. But if I had a black-sounding name and I applied for a job, I'm less likely to get the job simply because I have a black-sounding name. And we know this from this sort of study. And so, we know that there's profiling. We know the research shows that African Americans, Hispanic Americans are more likely to be in jail under the same circumstances. Now, some people, if a person is very wedded to ignoring the evidence, there's nothing you can do. But I think the evidence shows that no, we don't have Jim Crow, and we don't have slavery, and we don't have internment centers, and praise God for all that. But race still matters and still works to disadvantage people of color in certain situations. And, there are people who simply won't accept the evidence because they have certain psychological barriers that they just don't want to. It attacks their belief system so strongly. And so, at that point, you just move on. You're not going to reach everyone.
Next question, can we expect non-Christians to subscribe to the mutual accountability approach? Is it viable on a large scale in an increasingly post-Christian society?
Yes, I think that we can use it, because I'll tell you, the research on collaborative conversations, a lot of it now is in therapeutic relationships and in educational settings, which are not, so these are not Christian settings, and they're showing promise. So yes, when we present evidence that this is working, then we can ask non-Christians, look, this is working, why not do this? The example I would give you is forgiveness, okay? While forgiveness is not an exclusive Christian concept, clearly the notion of forgiveness is pushed hard by Christians. And it could be seen as a Christian virtue. But we also have a lot of research now that shows that forgiveness is very valuable to our own mental health. People don't forgive, become angry, bitter, depressed. So you don't have to say, hey, you should forgive more because it's a Christian thing to do. You can say, psychologists will tell you, forgiveness is an important component to moving forward in our lives. So we can, if we couch it right, and if we're showing the example in our churches, then that's gonna make it easier for us to appeal to non-Christians. My vision is that, and if non-Christians want to come to me and talk to them, I will. You know, if some non-Christian organization says, we've heard what you're doing, would you talk to us? I will do that in a heartbeat, because I do want to get this out everywhere. But my vision is that we as Christians start championing this. Non-Christians see that something's happening here. And not only do we improve race relations, not only do we build our Christian community because we have built community instead of polarization, we build a more powerful witness to the rest of the world.
Yeah, and I think that's key. And Joseph began the night with that concept, is that our vision is not to make the world the church. It's for the church to be the church and to offer something to the world that the world could never be apart from Jesus. Yeah. And I do think that the hope of this whole conversation is the church showing the world a totally different way. And I think you've done a great job showing us that tonight. Here's a question. We live in a suburb with about 5% African-American population. How do we encourage diversity in our church when we are not a very African-American diverse community? It seems we have natural limits to how diverse we can be as a church. Do you have suggestions?
Yeah, yes, if your community is 5% African-American and that's where you draw people from, then yeah, it's gonna be hard for you to be more than 5% African-American. There are other racial groups though. There's Hispanics, there's Middle Easterners, there's Native Americans, there's Asian Americans, and so there may be more diversity. I would value churches become more diverse, but churches are limited by some churches are limited by where they are at, and I fully acknowledge that. But even if our churches are not diverse, we can have more diverse social networks. In this day and age with social media, we can meet people all across the country and develop more diverse social networks, or at our schools or at our work. And so while a church in, say, Utah is only going to be so diverse as far as African Americans are concerned, but people in that church can have diverse social networks given what the resources we have today.
Here's a question. You didn't touch on it tonight, but it's something that someone's curious about. Why is it socially acceptable for a race to use specific words, language, but unacceptable if a different race uses the same word?
Yeah, that is an interesting aspect. I know the words people are talking about, which I will not use, even though I'm of that race. And I don't like that word either. In fact, my wife and I have agreed that when our boys use that word, that they will be tasting soap. So I don't think it's that clear cut that, if you assume that all people of a certain race are okay with it. I think you're looking at certain subgroup populations within that race. Most of us older folks know more about the meaning of that word in ways. And so we're not very tolerant of it. Now, having said that, yes, there are certain triggers. One of the things to just keep in mind, and by no means am I defending, like I said, I don't like that word, and my boys will not be using that word, or they'll only use it one time in their life when I'm around. We do need to be sensitive to how we say things, because how we say things can shut people off. And so let me come at this from a different direction. I ask my progressive friends to rethink using concepts such as white supremacy, unless we're talking about what's traditionally known as white supremacy. Now, white supremacy in academic settings can be used more than just personal prejudice. It's about a system that builds in advantages for whites, and we can call this white supremacy. I get that as an academic. I don't think it's useful, because once you use that term in the context, other than talking about something like the Klan or something like that, then people start turning off, and they legitimately cannot hear you because they feel threatened. This is a psychological process that can take place. So it's not just that you can't use certain racial epithets, because that has the same effect, obviously. But I think all of us have to learn this is part of how to communicate with one another. Communicate with people where they're at. And you don't shock them just for the sake of shocking them. You can be blunt, but you don't shock for the sake of shocking, because what that does is a person feels threatened, and they'll turn off, and then they can no longer hear you. I mean, they hear your words, but it no longer resonates because they've turned off when we feel threatened. And so that's something to consider on how we're going to approach individuals.
Excellent, thank you. How much should the church focus on race? How do we care in a healthy way without the race issue becoming our sole identity?
Now, that's a great question. When I was studying multiracial churches about 15, 20 years ago, I discovered something very interesting. Churches that were racially diverse rarely, if ever, made being diverse their major focus. What happened is they made something else their major focus. In order to accomplish that, they became diverse. So for just this one example, there's this church that made its decision to reach the whole city for Christ. So they sent these buses all through the city picking up these kids to bring them to church. Well, this church was almost all white. And when they sent the buses to the white neighborhoods, for the most part, the kids weren't getting on the bus, but they were in the black neighborhoods. So the pastor, when we interviewed him, said, I don't care about being diverse. I don't, the word woke wasn't around at that time, but PC was. I don't care about being politically correct. I want to win people to Christ. But to win people to Christ, we have to bus in the black kids to become diverse, so be it. I think we focus in on race because it's part of a larger goal that we have. And if we do that, then we appropriately we take it seriously, but it doesn't become our sole identity. I never said that my race is my primary identity. My primary identity is being a Christian. But being a black is one of my social identities as well, just like being a man is, just like being a UT Longhorn is. Although football, sometimes that identity is going down. Pastor, they just can't hold a lead. What can I say? But you get what I'm saying. Yes, we should pay attention to it. No, it's not should be our sole or primary identity. But to do your primary identity, if you want to reach our post-Christian society, I think we're going to have to deal with race.
And I'll just add something to that. I do think when you look at the New Testament, you do see that the race issue, the ethnicity issue was a big deal. In fact, the very first crisis in the church in Acts chapter 6 is a crisis surrounding ethnicity. You have Hellenistic widows who are being overlooked in the distribution of food. And it wasn't just that widows were being overlooked, but that the Hellenistic widows in a predominantly Jewish congregation. And so the concern was this could split the church. We don't want a Hellenistic church and a Jewish church. We want the church of Jesus. And so they diverted that crisis by assigning people to care for those Hellenistic widows. And then when you look at even the book of Galatians and you look at the book of Ephesians, there's such an emphasis on the fact that Jesus, through his life, death, and resurrection, has taken two classes of people, the Jews and the Gentiles, who have tremendous animosity, and has created in them, in Christ, one new humanity. And Paul was very concerned about ethnic relationships in the church. In fact, he tells us in Galatians, he confronted Peter because Peter started showing favoritism to Jewish Christians and would no longer eat with Gentile Christians. And Paul confronted him on it face to face, saying, look, this is a real issue. And so though we don't want to say that race is the issue in the Bible, we also want to be aware that the Bible's very concerned, especially the New Testament, concerned with ethnic unity in the church, that we actually live as the family of God in all of our diversity. So we're not saying it's an issue. We're saying that the gospel is at stake when we don't keep in step with that gospel and love each other in all of our differences and all of our diversity and be a unified family in Jesus. So, but yeah, I think we also, that can't be the flag we're waving. So,
and let me just add something else. One of the things that I've also studied things as anti-Christian attitudes in our society. And we are in a post-Christian society. And I believe for Christians to thrive in a post-Christian society, we have to build our communities. And that community has got to be multiracial. We're no longer 50 years ago, maybe we could have whites over here and blacks over here and Hispanics over here and be okay because we had a mostly Christian society. That's no longer the case. So, either we hang together, we hang apart, literally. And so, to me, to meet the goal of a multiracial community, we have to deal with race. Doesn't make this the primary issue, but I think that we have to take it seriously.
Excellent. Critical race theory is a huge hot button in society right now. How does this fit or not fit into the Christian viewpoint or the Christian path forward?
Yeah, boy, another one. critical race theory, realistically, I'll just put it this way. You know, if I start trying to explain what it is, then I'll be here for another 20 minutes just doing that. I think that it does a good job looking at problems. It does a poor job looking at solutions. I'll just put it that way. And I think it could be a useful tool to find problems. I don't think it's a useful tool to find solutions. And so as a Christian worldview point, you know, you could be a Christian and believe in critical race theory. You could be a Christian and think that critical race theory is not that useful. I mean, it's not a salvation issue. I would say that we can learn from using it when we can to identify potential problems, but I think the solution comes back then to listening to others and healthy interracial relationships to solve problems, not just for the sake of the relationship, but to solve problems. And I think critical race theory does not lend itself to that. So yeah, I would not argue that it's a distinctive Christian approach. But it could be used just like, capitalism is not a distinctive Christian system, but we can use capitalism in order to build economies.
We'll be having another equipping seminar on capitalism soon, I'm sure. Just kidding, we're not doing it. Should I feel bad about saying black instead of African American? Is there a right, wrong, or better, worse?
It varies. Probably certain areas of the country, they use black more than African Americans. There's probably some educational differences there. I mean, if you say black or African American, and someone says, "Oh, please call me black or African," then of course, the respectful thing to do is to do what the person asks. Other than that, I wouldn't worry about it.
All right, next question. As a white individual, I find myself being silent on issues of race for fear of offense or those who experience it regularly. What are some practical ways I can come alongside the black community in a way that's loving, dignifying, and validating?
Okay, yes. So one of the things about this is, when we can develop communities that have conversation, then we could have honest dialogue. But if we don't have those communities, then it's harder to. Now, one of the ways we can get there is to develop relationships. Different groups are at different stages of being able to enter into these sort of conversations. Some black churches are ready for it, eager for it, others are far away from it. So you have to make an assessment. And I would tell African Americans, some white churches are ready for it, some white churches are not. You have to make an assessment where this community is. If they're not ready for it, the best thing you can do is develop relationships, build a rapport, walk alongside. And when you walk alongside, the way to walk alongside is not to come in and say, "Hey, we should do this. I'm gonna help you do this." You walk alongside by, "What are you doing? How can I help you do what you're doing?" Developing those sort of relationships, ideally, over time, can eventually get to the point to where those conversations become possible. But we can't force a type of conversation on people who are not ready for it, who are not prepared for it. And we have to build the rapport before we can get there. And so that would be my focus for someone who feels that they can't have these conversations yet, but wants to get to that point of moving towards that. And then hopefully as it becomes, my hope is that this notion of conversations becomes more popular and people want to engage in it, as well as those who have interacted with you and developed a sort of openness to have this sort of freedom, to have those sort of dialogues. And I will say, if you develop friends, you all know when you develop friends, you can open up and talk to them about things you can't with people you don't know very well. So part of it is just that friendship building.
Excellent. What practical steps do you suggest to our church body in this approach?
Okay, so not knowing the church that well, it's the first time I've ever been in this church building. So I would have to give you, a more generic things of I want to try to move this idea through the Christian community as well as non-Christians as I get the idea to. I'm trying to develop some avenues in order to do that. One is a book that I do have coming out in March, and you put some flyers back there, so if you're interested in that. Also, I'm developing a program at Baylor for collaborative conversations in race to foster both research and to try to build a community people who are interested in this. As that goes on, I'll pass it to your pastor, and he can pass it on to you as you see fit. Beyond that, things such as developing relationships that are racially integrated, developing them towards an eye of eventually, you don't start off the first part of the relationship jumping into things that are sensitive, but eventually having these sort of conversations with individuals. The church perhaps can develop relationships with other congregations. Once again, if you've not had much interaction with them, walk alongside them for a while. Don't come in and say, hey, we're gonna do this. What are they working on? We want to help you doing what you're doing. And let those relationships flower. It may take a couple years before they're ready to start really engaging in that. But it's going to take a little bit of time because it's taken hundreds of years to get here. So it's not going to happen overnight, unfortunately.
Do you support the term racial reconciliation or perhaps racial harmony as a description of the Christian approach to this problem? Some suggest the idea of reconciliation is not appropriate given the responsibility is not the same for both parties to resolve it.
I personally don't have a problem with reconciliation. I don't think it means exactly that. In fact, I don't know how it can mean that because, like, if you have a couple that has a problem and there's a reconciliation, it doesn't mean that they had the man may have been more at fault or the woman may have been more at fault. You just don't know. So reconciliation to me does not inherently mean that there's an equal faultness or equal responsibility. It just means that you've figured it out, you've come together. So I don't have a problem with that term personally. And like I said, I do think that there are some mutual responsibilities of all parties as far as to enter into the conversation. I don't back away from that 1 inch. I don't necessarily think that the solutions are going to exist. That does not mean that there's an equal responsibility, but we come from different places in our society, and so we have to understand that. And the solution may not be of equal responsibility. In fact, I think it's likely not to be. But you put all solutions on the table. So I just, for me, I don't see a problem with it. If someone else does, then I guess they can explain why they have a problem with it.
Excellent. What's something you would ask white Christians to do that you wouldn't ask of minority Christians and vice versa? Is there anything?
That's an interesting question because part of what I want to do is try to enter into these conversations without any sort of presuppositions on what the solution is going to be. And so if I was to say, well, at the end of this, whites need to do da-da-da, or at the end of this, Bill Clinton need to do da-da, then I would be doing that. Do I think that there are different responsibilities? Yes, I do. But I'm hesitant to say that for that very reason. I think that the best thing to do is to have the conversation. Because I think what will naturally happen is we'll begin to see the differences and see things that need to be taken care of. I know people have had these conversations and whites have tended to react in certain ways that I thought were appropriate, given what they're hearing, and people of color begin to act ways that I think were appropriate. So I think I'm going to let that be, it sounds like I'm dodging the question. Maybe I am. But I think that it's better for us to go into these conversations without a presupposition on what the answer is going to be.
And if I could just piggyback on that question and ask you something. And I just think it's normal for a lot of white Christians to say, look, I don't really feel a sense of responsibility. Mm-hmm. I didn't have slaves. I haven't acted in racially prejudiced ways. I don't have personal responsibility. What would you say to someone who's either one of two things, hasn't done the hard work of looking internally and seeing where there are hidden prejudice, but two, the idea of this corporate, personal responsibility issue and seeing, I don't think I should take responsibility corporately because I'm not guilty of these things personally. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so all right, I think that confuses the notion of I, individual, am responsible versus there's an institution that's responsible. And one way I think about it is this. I live at a nice house in Denton, Texas. Now, I've not looked at the whole history of Denton, Texas, but given what I know about Native Americans, I'm willing to bet that at one point that land was owned by Native Americans. And the way it was taken from them was not fair. Maybe they were driven off by the military, maybe they were forced to sign a treaty, maybe they were signed a treaty which took away their rights and they were fooled. I'm probably pretty sure, I can't say with 100%, that the land my house is on, that I am benefiting from, is due to Native Americans being mistreated. So what does that mean? Does it mean that I mistreated them? No. Does it mean that I have benefited from a system that mistreated certain groups of people? Yes, it does. So how am I as a Christian to handle the fact that there's been a mistreatment that I have benefited from? I can't go back and give the land to the people that was originally taken from. I can't, we can't change the whole system at this lane date. What I can do is look at where Native Americans are today and work towards seeing what we can do to bring a sense of justice, which is making things right. What that looks like is going to be part of the ongoing conversation, and that's why, the Native Americans have to be brought into this conversation as well. We have to recognize that reality. Now, I say this as an African American, which of course, I have things that I could say, what's happened historically, but I recognize that even though I'm an African American, I have benefited from the way Native Americans have been mistreated in our society. I should have a repentance towards that reality. Not that I myself have done it, but that I have benefited from it. And now, where do I go from here? I don't have all the answers on where I go from on that, but I can't go back to Africa or anything like that. So, but that's something that I had to struggle with. That's the sort of struggle that I think that we should think about, rather than saying, well, I didn't individually do it, so what am I supposed to do? Am I supposed to apologize for something I didn't do? No one's asking you to apologize for something you did not do, but to have an awareness of these sort of dynamics.
That's helpful. How do I even start seeing opportunities to enter conversations of mutual listening and accountability?
Yeah, so, the way I see it is, right now in our society, we have this huge behemoth called colorblindness, and this another huge behemoth called anti-racism, and then a tiny swath of us who are into collaborative conversations. And so we got to grow. And part of what I'm doing is trying to help grow this sort of network. But in the meantime, before we grow, we just have to be wise as serpents. I'm sorry, is that wise as serpents? Is that right? Is that wise as serpents? Is that the verse? Okay. So we just have to be smart. There are people out there who are open to the conversation and people out there who are not. And just as we're doing, we have to test the waters, and people are open to the conversation, we engage with them. We learn for ourselves. So even if there's not people open to the conversations, we do some readings. We listen to other folks. Maybe part of what we need to do is listen for a while. And then we know how to talk to people. One of the values of having collaborative conversations is the next time we have a racial incident, we know more of what's driving people who we normally don't agree with. And it doesn't mean we agree with them, but we know now how we can talk to them, reach out to them. So, you gotta make sure you have a social network that's diverse enough to make the conversation happen. You gotta develop sort of friendships within that to where there's people you can become comfortable with. And then as opportunities come up, you have those sort of conversations. And I'll just close with this. When I was in college, my best friend was a white guy. And we talked about, he was a Christian guy. And we talked about God, we talked about girls, we talked about football, and we talked about, politics, we talked about everything but race. Because I was not willing to have the conversation with him, because I was afraid to have the conversation with him. I know that race was important to me at the time because I had another friend who wasn't my best friend, but was Hispanic. And I didn't talk to him about everything, but I did talk about racial issues. So at some point we have to look at ourselves and go, okay, do I only talk about certain things with certain people? And then will I be willing to take the risk once I develop the relationship? This is my best friend. I should have been able to talk to him about these sort of things. Will I be willing to take the risk to open it up and see where it goes?
I think we have time for a couple more, I believe. And I'm just going to take pastoral prerogative here, and I'm going to ask Ben's question. In your experience, What are the major obstacles for people of color joining homogenous churches?
I would say that, the major obstacle, all right, if a church is mostly white, there are certain people of color who are going to be more open to joining, who are probably culturally more attuned to that culture. So what happens is that, these people are, however you want to put it, more culturally white. The things in white culture that they tend, just music, for example. Maybe they're less likely to listen to hip hop and jazz and that sort of things, and more likely to listen to, what's white music? Country western? Okay. George Strait. That's how most country western I know is George Strait. Okay, but then in time, other people of color will come, and they are not as culturally in the homogenous culture. And so those are the ones that are going to be more uncomfortable unless a church makes an attempt to reach out to them. Now, what would that look like? Diverse leadership would be one thing. You look up and you see people like you in leadership. That'd be very important. The worship style would be another aspect, another element. There are certain worship songs that are connected to certain racial cultures. The core, are all the pictures on the church walls, are they of only one racial group? Is there intentionality to reach out to individuals, to figure out what they're interested in and to try to minister to them in those needs? And so it's going to take more work than normal to reach out to someone who comes from a different culture. Now, it's not just race, right? So if your church attracts mostly upper middle class individuals and working class people come to your church, you're going to have to do more work to bring those people in because they're not going to feel as comfortable. So anytime people come in with a different culture, you have to do more work than normal in order to bring them in. And so that's a way to think about it. And that's why you have to think about things such as mentoring and the core and worship styles and things of this nature when you want to try to attract beyond the first wave who will come in, who will be culturally, they'll be two-stepping for you. Then you're gonna have to work for the next waves.
I believe this is going to be our last question, and it's this two-part one. On talking to kids about race, specifically, if kids may say a comment that is ignorant, because kids are ignorant, well, it's similar. What are some ways of simply communicating it's good to acknowledge that friends have different skin color and hair, etc., and it's beautiful, God created us differently, but that it's not okay to say, I don't want to play with that baby doll because it's black, or I like my white skin better than black skin?
Okay, so those are two things the kids have said.
Same question.
Okay, yeah, all right. First, of course, like I said, I'm learning too right now about kids. So this is probably the hardest question for me tonight because of the whole situation. I'm trying to learn myself. I think that what my wife and I have decided to do and try to help our boys racially is, as well as develop our relationship with them, is to try to introduce them to for example, to books or to videos that introduce the concept of race to them, like some of the historical things that have happened. Now, understand, my oldest is 6, so it's age-appropriate stuff. I'm not about to show them, something that's he's not ready for. But I want them to know that we have a racialized history, and race has mattered in our society and continues to matter. And so in an age-appropriate way, we're trying to introduce him to some of these ideas right now. One thing that she does is she reads Little House on the Prairie. And so she has some interest. I don't know if you've read it. I didn't watch the show. I haven't read the book. Don't want to, but she's
it's so good, just the
I know,
show.
It probably, it probably is. She is an English. She used to be an English teacher before she started having kids, and so she loves it. But they talk about the way she talks to my boy about the way the Native Americans were treated in that book, and so there are opportunities to start bringing this up. I'm not sure And once again, I'm like a beggar looking for bread on this myself, because I'm trying to figure out for my voice as well. So I'm being honest and raw with you all on this one. I'm not sure having a let's have a race talk is the best way. I think as things come up, and honestly, this is the way I'm feeling about the birds and bees too. While I'm going to initiate that one a little bit more, I think what's going to happen is as things come up and if we've already talked about this, so my 6-year-old has been reading, my wife's been reading Little House of Prairie to him. So she's already brought up, sometimes people have been treating others badly because of their race. And so we've talked about that. So when these sort of issues come up, then I think it's going to make it easier for us to go back and revisit that. And so that's kind of where I am at as far as trying to deal with that with kids. I tell you, if someone could write a really good book on talking to kids about race, I would totally support it. But it can't be it can't be Kinley's How to Raise an Anti-Racist Baby book. Nor could it be a book that we have to ignore race. It has to be a book that's, these are hard issues, delicate issues. How do you approach it? And I haven't found that book yet.
Thank you so much
Thank you.
for investing in us tonight, teaching us. So very grateful. And this is kind of a segue. We do have a book out in the atrium that's written for parents who are wanting to have this conversation with their children. It's more just trying to capture our kids' attention that God has made a lot of diverse, beautiful people in his image. And so parents encourage you to pick that book up. When I say pick that book up, I mean pay for it and pick it up. And then also, we are starting an actual discussion of the book Beyond Racial Gridlock that Dr. Yancey wrote several years ago. That discussion starts October 28th. You can get the book out in the atrium as well, and you can register online. I believe you received a card when you came in. You can scan that QR code, go straight to registration, and it's going to be a great discussion as we just talk about this mutual accountability and how do we engage in these conversations. And so hope that you'll be a part of that. Also tonight, we've got cookies and coffee in the atrium. Also on that book table, Beyond Racial Gridlock, there's also a flyer that's an announcement for Dr. Yancey's newest book coming out, if you're interested in learning more about that. And we do ask you this, you have to pick your kids up tonight, all right? You have to do that. And I think by at least 6:45, you need to have your kids picked up, all right? I believe so. Is that right, Bowen? Okay, great. I don't know, I just work here. All right, so I'm going to ask Taylor Brooks, one of our elders, to come up and close our night in prayer. And again, thank you so much. Thank you so much for serving us so faithfully tonight. It's very helpful, very encouraging. Greatly appreciate it. Thank you. I'm going to have Taylor come and pray. And also, Taylor, if you'd pray for Dr. Yancey's ministry and close our time out tonight.
So I'll be praying what I'm thinking about. You guys will be praying what you're thinking about. You've heard a lot tonight, but one of the verses that Dr. Yancey uses, because spoiler alert, what he does is he helps us see that Jesus is a solution. So if you're looking for another set of rules, another checklist that, well, if I just do these things, then I'll be doing my part. Just like we live the Christian life because it's Christ in us, that's the racial reconciliation and the mutual responsibility that you'll hear him talk about is Christ in me. So y'all be praying for him as I'm saying my words, and let's go to the Lord in prayer. Heavenly Father, as we just heard tonight, just how glorious it is that you would desire that brothers and sisters live together in unity. Man, I love that word family that Dr. Yancey talked about, Lord, where we would be a collaborative family. But my family's dysfunctional, and I know that churches can be, and other big families and countries, and we see that. So, Lord, would you bring the healing that you can bring, Jesus, through a word and through a touch because of your power. And God, help us believe that same resurrection power to live by faith, live this life in the flesh by faith, that Christ is at work in me, that he who is in the world is not greater than he who is at work in me. So God, when we see all of the problems around us and we feel the pressure of just that we could do nothing, or we feel the pressure and we just have outbursts of anger, or we have fear. Jesus, would you calm those? Would you bring us back to a place where we recognize you as Lord over all creation? And would you help us to be your ambassadors, asking people to join your body? And would you help us to be winsome in how we do that, Lord? Loving as you loved people, listen to people. God, we ask you to bless this time where we might spend, as a church, spend some conversations talking about this book. Let it be a conversation starter for us. Grow our groups of people who would be willing to take the next step to be learning how to have those conversations by going through a book study. And God, for Dr. Yancey, he voiced it, and I just want to agree with him in prayer, Lord, that you would prepare him to have these hard conversations with his children. And God, as he humbly said, how would you do that? You could talk to academics about this, but to talk to a 5-year-old or 6-year-old, Lord, would you give him wisdom? Would you give us wisdom as we talk to our kids about it? And would you bless our fellowship tonight, Lord? Make it sweet. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. You're dismissed to go get some cookies.